welcome to New Work Conversations, where we discuss how to create fulfilling workplaces. I'm Manuel from New Work by Design, and my guest today is Steffen Reitz. My conversation with Steffen focuses on how he came to be interested in self-organization as a founder of a SaaS company, and consequently going all in and transforming the company. The central theme is Steffen's journey to consciously work on and transform company culture. He highlights the shift in his leadership approach, including breaking up the company's functional silos into cross-functional teams, and the challenges faced in delegating power and fostering intrinsic motivation among employees. Steffen also openly reflects on his internal struggles and insecurities, touching on personal crisis, therapy, and the impact of ego and extrinsic validation. We explored how his day-to-day work evolved, his relationships with employees, and the creation of a more authentic and motivating work environment. We concluded with a broader reflection on how these transformations in the workplace parallel changes in other areas of his life, including parenting. I've known Steffen for 7 years. We worked together for 2 of them after he hired me at the beginning of the company transformation. I still remember on my very first day helping to rearrange desks because all teams were reshuffled from functional into cross-functional teams. I have very fond memories of these 2 years. Not only did I refine my thinking around organizational design during that time, which eventually turned into the 9 org key practices that my online course is built on, but I also formed many lasting relationships with people I care about. And for that, I'm very grateful. I appreciate Steffen for his seemingly insatiable hunger for learning and growth, and I admire his courage for making bold moves with uncertain outcomes. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Steffen. Well, I'm again at this point where usually hosts say, Steffen, welcome to the show, but I don't have a show. So Steffen, welcome to the conversation. The topic I would like to talk to you about today is what happens in a founder's mind when they want to consciously work on the company culture. You started a SaaS company right out of university. Somewhere along the way, you decided that you wanted to make a conscious shift about the company culture. And I would like to understand what happened right at this moment. What would you say were your experience beforehand, and what were the pain points? What were you worried about? Maybe what even kept you up at night because you kept thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the decision to really dive deeper into the whole topic of not just changing the culture, which basically back then I assumed was everything and nothing, and I had no clue what culture really was, and even more so how I can influence the culture. So that decision to really work on the organization came in like 4 years in, right? 2014, I believe. However, the company was about 2 years old when we started getting the first coaches on board. So I think that was probably the moment when for the first time I realized I need to work on my own leadership skills and abilities, but also I want to work somehow on the team as a whole. So in 2012, roughly after 2 years, we brought in the first set of coaches, which were very traditional leadership coaches. But for the first time, we brought in the like inner work and self-work into the company, right? So that's seeing the shift that it brought to me and also to the team was definitely the reason why I continued, and when I really started falling in love with working on myself and working on the company. Over the next 2 years, we had realized more and more as we were growing and raising venture capital money, and then the team grew to 30 and 40 people, we realized the problems got bigger, exponentially bigger. Also, my ability to lead didn't obviously grow overnight. It was still ongoing, so obviously it's a lifelong journey. But I think I had tried enough things in the meantime that didn't work, that when then Frederic Laloux published Reinventing Organizations in 2014, and I just happened to read it a few weeks after it came out, it fell on fruitful soil. And I was really open to diving at full speed into the whole topic of self-organization, understanding it better, which I had no clue until then what it actually was. And I haven't even heard about the concept of self-management, self-organization until reading the book. So I think I was really just very curious. And then when the book came out and Laloux published those 12 companies that he presented, I was just super eager to understand more about it. And then I invited the first freelance people in to speak to them and hear what and how we could go about to bring this into the company.
Okay, so that's one thing, being curious about it, maybe inviting a few people to speak to it and maybe have a conversation with them. But then you decided to go even deeper, hire someone to work on this topic full time. So what happened in between? When was that moment when you said, oh yeah, no, we really need to invest money in this to make this right, whatever that means?
Yeah. So I think it was a combination of a few single events. One was that I believe it was roughly in 2013, after 3 years, where we had a team meeting, and some of the first people who had joined the company in 2010, 2011, who were like super motivated, almost working as much as us founders, right, who were putting in crazy hours. Some of those people fell asleep in a team meeting. And I realized we had built a team where there was such a low energy, it was painful to look at. And specifically, it was painful because it was definitely not what a startup, in my mind, was supposed to provide as an environment. And I kind of started realizing that I had failed building a culture where everybody else was as motivated as me. And I was just working like crazy hours in the first couple of years, but realizing that one of my missions to build a great place to work, which probably was the idea as soon as I realized we will hire people, and this is not just going to be a 2 or 3 people's show, like it was in the very first days. So realizing that I had built a place that did not meet my criteria was so painful that I started to work on it. And as I then went out to speak to other founders about it, there was a few months after the book came out, and maybe it was a year later, I met the founder of Stylight back then, which I think you were probably working at back at the time, who also told me that he read the book and he started applying some of those things. And it was the first time that I kind of got a data point that it's not just in a book, but it can actually work for any company. So I think speaking to Benjamin back then really helped me understand it's possible and feasible. And then I went out to speak to a consultancy, which was focused on HR leadership, which I believe was also a company you happened to work at before. So obviously a few data points that eventually made our paths cross. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it was the combination of the pain I had in my own company and some trust markers, both with the book and then also founders that had used those principles. I don't know how far they went. You probably know better, but at least I had heard that it's not just esoterical bullshit, but it actually works. Which is one of the questions most people ask when they read about those principles. Right? Like, but does it really work for a real company? Something like that. So I think that's why it wasn't just curiosity, but why I really decided to go all in and learn more about it.
A couple of things I want to dive into and have to think about which one first. Let's go with the thing that you just said. Does it really work? So now, many years later, I don't know, 8 years later, what do you think? Does it really work?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, luckily, we're now at a different time, right? When I first read the book, we just had the 10-year anniversary of Reinventing Organizations of Lalou a few weeks, I think 2 weeks ago. So I think by now we're lucky enough to have many more data points of companies where it works, like where whatever principles they adopted, whether it was holacracy or any self-mix of self-organizing principles. I think we know enough that it does work, provided, and that's probably the big but only provided the founder has the attitude that they want to make it work. So I have seen time and again that companies start embarking on the path of transforming the culture towards more agility, more fluidity, distributing power, self-organizing principles. And then when it starts, the first roadblocks show up or the first difficulties show up, they go backwards full speed and they just throw out the whole, I would say, even attitude with which they started, and they just blame the system and say, yeah, after all, people aren't mature enough, or after all, employees you can't trust them that much, and that's why it doesn't work. And it's nice to read it in a book, but it doesn't work in real life. So I would say it totally works, but I have seen many more cases of companies that started embarking on the path and reversed at some point than companies that kept it up all the way through, unfortunately. And that's a sad part of the story.
Yeah, totally. And of course, those are also more public because everyone likes a failure story.
Totally.
So what is it then that what do you think the founders have in places where it actually really works long term compared to the places where they revert?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't think I know the answer. I can only give you my best guesses. I think so. If I look at myself, right, the moment I embarked on this journey, I had lived through a massive, massive psychological crisis 5 years prior to that in 2009, severe depression, all in. I had at this point been in the psychoanalysis for 4 years, starting in 2010, the year I started the company. So I had already done a lot of work, of inner work, right? And I totally believe that the path of giving away power and distributing power and starting to question traditional management principles sooner or later confronts us with our own fears, and that is the fear of delegating, the fear of giving up, the fear of giving up responsibility, which funnily enough is almost for any person who becomes a leader is a topic at first, that they either don't trust enough to give up, or like they micromanage, or they give away power too quickly and they trust too much in a way. So I think at some point we're all facing that moment where we have to deal with our own fears and question how much ego do I have that wants to hold on to power because it feels healthy and it feels good. And sometimes ego obviously does feel good. And how much am I willing to work on myself, which in all honesty is a painful process. So most founders I've met who really built beautiful companies and who stick to it for many, many years, sometimes until they exited and then they sold the company and then it reversed for obvious reasons because the buying company didn't buy into that. But whenever the founders went into their journey, it was never an easy journey. So it was always combined with deep and sometimes painful inner work. And frankly, not everybody wants that. It's just much easier to just follow the path of ego and status and be the king or the queen at the top of the company and hold on to that power. It's much easier, and it's what everybody else does. So it does take a lot of courage and willingness to go through that pain because there's somehow an inner belief that something better will come out at the end at the other end, and that's both for the company and for ourselves as well, right? And whenever somebody has tasted enough of that sweetness of sticking to it long enough, they never want to go back, right? And then many of them become coaches or become ambassadors of self-organizing principles. But for many people, I think it's too painful, and that's why they just at some point they stop and they go back.
So I guess the decisive question, if you want to work with founders, how many years of psychotherapy have you already done? Does it make sense to start this?
I mean, the great thing is I have so there's two breeds of people who I think are suited for that topic, and there's the breed of people who really had to deal with some shit and who really went through a lot of pain, and often it's a personal crisis. But there is the other breed, which I wasn't lucky enough to be one of them, but I have met people who had such a wonderful childhood and parents that they never needed this life crisis, right? So there are people who, when they're kids, they already they grow up embracing their emotions, and they're allowed, any emotion is allowed, and they grow up in this household that I never imagined is possible, at least not 20, 30, 40 years ago. But there are people who are lucky enough to have parents that parented them back then, like I would today hope is the healthy parenting I'm trying to adopt myself. So there are people who never had to go through that kind of deep personal crisis to get to that belief that we can lead in a healthier way by not holding on to power. But for most of the people, most of the founders I have met who built such companies, it was actually a personal crisis somehow along the early adulthood that was part of the journey.
Yeah. Well, I do believe, and I quote George McGraw on that, it's that no one leaves childhood unscarred. So, everyone has their things to deal with. And of course, some people's packages are bigger than others.
Totally.
So, like you said, there is probably either you had to deal with something because it was unavoidable, or you just learned a few things early on in your childhood that make you prone to it. Right. So then let's go back into, well, here were the triggers, or what created the initial motivation and interest. What were your desires then? What were you hoping for in embarking on this journey? Like if you were daydreaming about the company in 5 years, what did that look like?
So I think starting from that team meeting, it was painful to realize how low energy the company, like the team was. I think there was probably, if I had to say, like the one KPI that I wanted to change, it was the level of motivation in the team. But funny enough, it wasn't a means to an end, as in I wanted to get more motivated people so we can win more customers and have more revenue. But I always had this, I don't know how it happened. That's probably something to dig into as well for me. But I always saw I was kind of building two companies. One was the economic engine with products and customers and so on. But I always had this feeling for me that the company itself and the organization and the workplace was one of the other products that I really felt like was my mission, at least starting with this wake up call in 2013. So I really wanted to build a great workplace because I somehow felt that, I don't know, probably I wouldn't have said back then it was my mission, but I probably, it's deep in my subconscious, it already was kind of a mission to build a great place, a great company. And in that, realizing I had built a low energy team and I had built a place that just paid the salary of people, it felt like a real failure. And the number one KPI I then wanted to change and to turn around was really, I wanted to intrinsically motivate people so they actually thrive and they love their work and they really blossom in this company. And they can live their full potential. And then together we have this vibrant, high-performing team where it's just so much fun to work and feel like in a roller coaster. So ideally without the the parts going down, but really feeling just like, I don't know, taking off and living this incredible journey together.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder like where my own drive for doing this work comes from. And like you already mentioned, history with family that you grew up in. And of course, it's probably somehow relates to that, or at least has some connection to it. And I'm sometimes wondering, am I just trying to recreate the family I really want in a company because I maybe didn't feel that belonging as I was growing up? I don't know. That's just a thought. What do you think about it?
Yeah.
Where do you think that drive
I
comes
mean,
from?
totally. If I look at what drives me today, to be honest, it's the same thing when I think of me in the sense of my family, my way of parenting. It's the same as the work principles I try to bring into companies, and it's the same as I would want in my dream, ideally, society to be transformed towards, right? And it influences the choices I make when I get to vote, which sadly in our country is only every couple of years. But so I think the core motivation is really about how do humans deal with one another? How do we treat each other? And how do we actually lead our relationships? And I think it's such a fascinating topic because it simply affects any and every single area of life. So yeah, I think it's probably a healthy mission, and the dimension I choose to apply it is work. But I could probably also be a couple counselor or helping destroyed families to get back together, or become a parenting trainer. I don't know, I'm very far from that, but I think the dimension is probably less important than the mission behind it, I would say.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I read a fair amount of parenting and couples books, and the similarities are just so striking. As in, it's not even a similarity; it's literally the same thing.
It's the same. The base is the same, exactly. Yeah,
just different context.
Yeah. And then maybe, I don't know, that's one theory I have, because my personal crisis in 2009 was linked to the world of work, because I literally was wondering what to do. And then I had done a couple of internships also in like strategy consultancies, supposedly great companies to work. And I really hated it. I really hated the world of work, but I already knew that work was somehow important for my life. So my crash was linked to my professional identity. And that's one of the reasons why I believe maybe later on creating healthy professional identities became one of my callings. And I didn't have a breakdown or like a burnout because of my relationship breaking down or my parent-child relationship for some other reason. I didn't have a child that left me and stopped speaking or stopping in touch with me. But my core problem was, who do I want to be in the world of work? So that's how I explained to myself that's why I became so fascinated about the topic of building great organizations. But it could also just be maybe it's just a story I'm telling myself.
Yeah, exactly. It's all just us rationalizing away the emotions that drive us.
Totally.
Can you say a bit more about that professional identity? What does that mean for you?
The term that comes to my mind is insecure overachievers. Because of the way I was brought up and because of the way I was in my peer group and my university and my studies and so on, I've always been around people who wanted to achieve a lot and who wanted to do good and have fantastic grades at university and do the best internships, have a great CV and then great career and have a lot of status. And all of that deep down obviously comes from purely extrinsic recognition. Now, that's the core unhealthy part, obviously. Then I'm since 15 years trying to repel and to reject to some part. It will always be in me to a certain degree. But I think that obviously the way I was brought up, a lot of satisfaction and self-worth come from what are others thinking about me, and am I worthy? And am I worthy directly transforms not from how much value do I build in my relationships, but how do I perform and how quickly do I get promoted and how is my salary and so on. And in my case, because I decided not to go down the corporate track, it wasn't, am I called a head of or VP at, I don't know, Allianz or Siemens or BMW, but the question was, how many employees do we have? How much money did we raise? But it's just the same unhealthy ego labels I'm relating to and I'm attaching my self-worth to, right? But I definitely think that realizing that through my crisis and not being able to reject it entirely, but realizing that a far too big amount of my self-worth was linked to performance helped me question it in the years going forward through therapy and through coaching and all those seminars and things I worked on later on.
So what do you think, or rather I make it about you, when you then changed your mind somewhere along the line and wanted to create a different type of company, what replaced that? Like that extrinsic motivation, that thinking of self-worth and how to get it?
So funnily enough, I think there's one thing that's maybe even scary to say or to admit is, to one degree, I didn't replace it entirely, because I actually at some point became so proud of building this new product. So the company became this product, right? At some point I stopped, quite early, removed myself from sales and many other processes because I didn't enjoy it. I wasn't great at it. And I was lucky enough that we had a team that was much better than me doing that. But I kind of started seeing this culture thing so much as my baby that I actually became so proud of it that probably in many parts, this became a replacement for the customers, the VC rounds, and so on. Now, I think it's much healthier, but I do believe there was, and up to this day, I'm not entirely, I have to lie to say, I don't care what other people think about me, right? I will never get rid of that in my life. And it's not only bad, the drive and energy I have, but of course that part, the extrinsic recognition part, is not a healthy one. I do think it was still in there that I really wanted to build a great culture, and I was really proud also of what we built. But then again, speaking on stages about the culture and the way we had distributed power and how I had myself to some degree made myself replaceable is probably still a healthier way than talking about the new company car and that now I have a lot right down our tower. I got a better parking lot because I got promoted, all those kind of career status things. But I probably would say I didn't manage to entirely replace the need for recognition, which at the end of the day is just a proxy for love. So I think I've still linked love and self-worth to recognition, but not in the same way as I did before.
How is it now?
I'm definitely not immune to what others think about me. I would love to be much more, I have to say. It still sometimes shocks me how big it is. But I think that the biggest difference is that, because I would say of myself that I'm quite self-aware, is that I don't let it guide my life anymore. So I think the biggest decisions I make in my life they don't come from that place anymore. But I sometimes realize how when I've done something where I've poorly performed or others could think that, how there's a feeling of shame that comes up, and I'm actually thinking of myself, shit, why is shame here now? It's good to realize it, but it's sad that I have to be ashamed of this now. But so I think it doesn't drive my life anymore. It doesn't guide my decisions, but it's I didn't manage to entirely get rid of it. But I think I have found a way to put it on the passenger seat, and it's no longer in the driver's seat. I think that's probably the biggest difference to the version of myself 10, 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah. And as far as I understand it, that's the best you can have.
Probably. Maybe someday in the back seats. I don't know.
They can change the seats, but they never leave the bus.
They probably won't leave the bus. Yeah. They might become a silent passenger, or more silent than today, but yeah, they probably will never leave the bus. Yeah.
Yeah. Just listened to a podcast yesterday, actually, with Dr. Becky Kennedy. Do you know her? Or have you heard of her?
Yeah, briefly, very briefly.
And she has this acronym AVP: acknowledge, validate, permit. And so how to use that in this context would be acknowledge for hey, shame, there you are again. What brings you here? Why are you coming up right now? And by the way, makes total sense in this context that shame will come up. I would just perform poorly. I understand why you're here. And permit is actually telling then yourself, it's okay to feel shame.
Yeah.
And that is apparently what keeps that part of you on the passenger seat and not like it's acknowledged, like, oh, I see you here. You don't have to sneakily take over the steering wheel. I can still drive. I acknowledge you. I try to get you what you need.
Yeah. And funnily enough, I think when the permit part is not there, which going back to what I was saying before, when as a founder, when I started embarking on this journey, I felt I was afraid, like there was fear that this could fail, this experiment, right? This could go wrong. I could lose, when I lose control, I might lose, I don't know what, the company and so on. I think I definitely had moments where I realized there was fear, but I kind of allowed it to be. And I think as in any emotion, whenever we try to block the emotion, that's the worst we can do, right? So I probably had some parts where I realized, okay, there's definitely fear and I'm afraid, but it's okay to be afraid in this moment because I've never done it before. It's the first time I'm letting go the way I'm doing it now. So the permit part is I like the acronym.
Yeah. No, I previously used another acronym by Google, something inner work. Don't quite remember the title.
Search inside yourself? Or?
Yes, that one. And they had a Siberian railroad thing that was like 6 steps. Basically trying to do the same thing, but no one ever remembers 6 steps. But AVP, I can remember. I think.
Yeah.
Well, off me next week. That was yesterday, but I think I will remember. Anyway, coming back to, you made that decision, things started happening. How did your day-to-day work in the company change?
So I think one of the things good and bad about me as a founder, or maybe as a person in general, I have a massive drive and almost incredible drive for things that I'm fascinated about. But I also I just let go of things that don't keep up my motivation. And the bad thing I think is I probably went out too quickly of some of the domains and areas where I had built processes that were still involving me. But the good thing is that I really loved this topic so much that I spent quite some time, a considerable amount of time on that. So what changed is that I tried to stop doing things like going on pitches for I don't know, being on the stage talking about the vision of the company for impressing VC or the press and so on. But I tried to start speaking more and more about the company culture. But now that I speak about it, I do remember I still had all those speaking things because our investors asked us to go here and there was an important conference somewhere to speak about the company. I still had those things, but I remember going, like, every time I would walk on stage, I would feel from year to year that it became so much more painful to talk about this product and the vision of the company because I didn't love it. It was not what kept me up at night. And it happened to be a SaaS company in the fintech space. And I was definitely not in love with the product anymore. And I really loved working on the company and on the people topics and not so much on building a better API for our large customers. So I think the bad part about me as a founder in that role was that I was not believing in the vision, and the vision was not strong enough for me that I could have that being also one of the glues for the company or the social tissue putting people together. Yeah.
Looking back, is there anything that you would do differently now?
About the whole transformation?
Well, especially the beginning parts. I mean, later on, a lot of things happen, but kind of like as you were guiding it to get going, is there anything that you would love to do differently if you were able to go back?
I think the most obvious thing is that because I also was so vocal about this kind of change that I had never lived through before, but I started feeling this is the right thing to do. We kind of became almost opponents of traditional leadership and opponents of power and opponents of hierarchies. And one of the things we see often in this movement now is that we try to say that everything which was there before was bad. And I think that led us to homegrown problems that we then had to deal with. And eventually the pendulum kind of found its path in the middle and we found our own way. But I definitely think it was not healthy how we tried to do everything differently or everything, 180 degrees against the ways we had dealt with it before. So I wish I had maybe a bit more softness, or I would have acted a bit calmer on that topic and not being so loud about having to do everything differently.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think that's one thing. Yeah.
I mean, hits straight to the core for me as well. I mean,
of course,
I wish I wish I would have advised you otherwise.
Yeah.
Actually, just this year I gave a talk 5 new work traps to avoid, and it's exactly always this, right?
Totally.
You're here in the pendulum, then it swings over here, and here is the healthy point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other thing that I do sometimes wonder, I mean, I have, the other day I did an exercise at a conference and I was asked we were asked like 50 people, or no, 150 people, whether we had any regrets in life. And most people walked on the one side where they said, yeah, I regret things about my life. And I actually didn't. I stayed on the part that I said, no, I actually don't regret anything about my life, because I truly believe that, of course, I couldn't have known, otherwise I would have done it differently back then. And I think if I hadn't walked through that extreme, I wouldn't have learned my lesson. And what I know now from my coaching attitude, being a coach, I know that somebody telling me I should have done it differently would never have made me learn that experience, right? It's just by experiencing it and by making the mistakes myself that I actually was able to integrate it. So I couldn't have known back then, but it was still painful. I won't hide it.
No, that makes, that with the regret makes total sense. I agree with you. That's why it's a conscious question to ask, would you do something differently now that you have the knowledge of, having lived through it? Or then do you regret anything? It's the second time I'm going to quote Josh. He loves to say, regret is the hope for a better past. That makes it so clear to me. Like, this is pointless.
It's pointless.
Hoping for a better past you're not going to change the past. So you can just, again, acknowledge the emotion is there, let it pass through, and then move on. So what would you say was the one thing, the one change that happened that had the biggest impact?
I mean, I will try to recall a few and then see if I can prioritize and find the biggest one. I mean, it definitely was my attitude of learning that I can be different. I don't need to hold on to power, and that things will work out. I think there was another one was definitely the fact. I think we started that just before you came on board. Breaking up the company from silos and functional departments to cross-functional teams. I think the power of that was massive for me, and it's phenomenal to see how people who actually then, ideally when every team is facing their own customers and they can speak with less than 12 people about the issues coming up. I think it's magic to how it can accelerate process and the motivation in a team. The way of decision making, obviously, but that's a big topic also, which can be across the whole company. It can also be in single teams. So if I had to think about it, I mean, I think the biggest thing at all, which is kind of both the catalyst but also the foundation for everything, is the willingness of the founders or even sometimes the owners to start working on the company as a constant flow. Because most of the companies I know, they might do an offsite once a year or maybe twice a year, and it's kind of the only time they work on the governance, they work on the structure of the company. And everything else is just working in the company and being stuck in operational business. So I think the realization of founders, and that luckily happens also in lower levels, or at least earlier in the consciousness path, before people start being open for self-organizing principles, is the realization that my role as a founder at some point is no longer my product is no longer how I steer my sales team or my product team or what roadmap I build, but the organization is actually is the biggest product I have. And I think once the entrepreneur starts realizing that, then they open up to build a company that's in line with how my attitude is. And as I grow as a person and I become more connected to myself and I trust more, I can start letting go of my own fears and I can embrace power distribution and trusting others more. But I think the reason why we so often hold on to the past and to past structures and to management the way this has been done in the last 200 years is probably because we don't work on the company, or founders don't work on the company, but they're just busy with their daily life and the roles they had since day one, and that kind of gave them some kind of fulfillment and recognition. And it's much easier at first to get recognition from sales, from winning over big customers and feeling important, because of course founder-led sales works 10 times better than non-founder-led sales. It doesn't scale at some point. So I think the realization that as founders, our role is to build a company, an organization and not just lead individuals or build a roadmap or have a vision or any of those single tasks that might be important, but it's not the core thing. That's probably what I would put as number one.
When do you think is the right time for that, for a founder?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure whether there is an answer that's like a true for anybody or for every company.
Let me
I think
rephrase the
probably
question.
yeah.
As a founder, how do I know that now is the right time for me?
So I think sometimes in the growth between 10 and 20 people, founders start realizing they have so much to do and their work week is like 80 hours and it could be 160 hours and there's always more to do. And there typically is a point that when we don't learn to delegate and to start working on taking ourselves out of some of the processes, it just becomes super painful. And a lot of people never give up then and they just cling on to the power and having 10 people report to me and I mean just the wording, right? That I'm controlling all the individual process and people. I think that's probably a moment when one of the first moments when we can realize that it's worth taking on this job of starting to work on the company and on my own role. So typically it's when I have too much on my plate, that's one of those first symptoms to start considering whether I might just be focusing and working on entirely the wrong topics, which are no longer the ones I should be working on.
So if I came to you as a founder today and I told you, I just found this book, Reinventing Organizations. I read it. I love it. It feels right. That's the kind of company I want to create. What advice would you give me?
I would say let's embark and let's take it one step at a time, because I think so. We didn't go particularly wrong, I think, ourselves and our company back then. But I think one of the big things I see in the industry, which I'm kind of an opponent, is this whole overnight we define this will be a self-organizing company and this is the end result, this is the end image. And there's a lot of also principles and frameworks like holacracy or living organizations and so on, which kind of always have this end goal in mind, that this is the company we will build in 12 or 18 months. And I personally believe it's not really healthy because we never know what will happen in 3, 6, 9, 12 months. So I would say as long as it's great that you're fascinated by it. Let's start, let's see, and let's just see where it will take you. But most likely the organic system we will build for your company, for you as a founder, will not be one of those exactly 12 represented in reinventing organizations, but it will be yours and it will be authentically yours. But it probably will not work if we use the exact same constitution that holacracy prescribes or any other stiff framework. So I really am much more in line nowadays with taking it organically and iteratively and just seeing what kind of company emerges. Of course, the principles behind it are often very similar, and all those frameworks have probably a similar attitude. But I do believe, and I would love to know what you think about it, I do believe that whenever we almost have this waterfall chart of this is the self-organization way we will have in 18 months from now, and we will sell, I don't know, I need to sell you 50 consultancy days to get that. It just feels like the world of McKinsey and BCG, right? And it's just, I don't know, it just feels very wrong to me.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
It's such a tricky problem because the certainty is so much easier to sell, right?
Totally. And nobody wants to buy uncertainty. I am totally with you.
So if you come to me as a founder and you say, I just read this thing, now what do I do? My chances of you buying from me are much higher if I tell you, this is the model we're going to implement. It's going to take us this long. It's going to cost you this much. And this is the result you get.
Yeah.
Which is understandable, right?
Totally.
We are humans and we like certainty. It feels really good. Or the other way around, uncertainty feels scary. There's a similarity that's like it's all over LinkedIn and whatnot right now. If you're in the scene, like, agile is dead and the whole thing. And the exact same thing happened, right? People were just selling methodologies and frameworks, and it was so popular. So people got on who had actually no own experience in it whatsoever. And in the end, nothing really changed for companies other than naming things differently.
Yeah.
And then players come on and they add more and more things to it. And in the end, like, it's this monster thing that we then call safe. Then the problem is nothing really changes. And now the companies have to save money. They cut all this out because they said, well, this didn't actually make a difference. And they're not wrong, if this is what they did. But, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, one of the core things was you deliver frequently, you get frequent feedback from customers, and show me any companies who claim they've done agile and it didn't make a change, who actually did that, who delivered frequently and who actually got feedback from customers that sat with the team. Not in general, some other department who did some surveys on a website and did an NPS score, but actually the development team talking to someone who uses their product. No one does that. And if you don't do that, you can't tell me you're doing agile.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing here, right? If we now make these models and sell them, but in the end, nothing really changes because the underlying principles are not understood and then used to adjust for the actual context, then we're going down the same path.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that some of those principles, which are so fundamental to this attitude and to this movement and then the way of working together, I would say that as founders start being curious about them, potentially early on, they don't buy into all those principles because they don't know them, right? So it's a difficult sell also to make when one of the core things why we do what we do and why we are convinced that it's the right thing to do might actually scare off people at first because it's so unknown and it's so unlearned. Now, luckily, now we're 10 years into this movement, or probably 30, 40 years on. I mean, there were companies in the 80s doing it, but it's becoming much more, the train is moving on faster, I would say, and there's many more companies successfully doing it, and some people like Corporate Rebels who are writing great books about it and doing some great social media activities, so it's becoming at least louder. But I definitely think that it's one of the difficulties still to sell, that for many people, the underlying principles are so unheard of that they wouldn't even buy into them and they wouldn't even sign them off before embarking on something. So it's not just that they don't know the end image and it feels super scary, but it's also that actually the principles of how to work in a different way is just scary and has never been done by them and by anybody they know in their peer groups before. It does need a few lonely wolves really to spearhead this whole thing for every single new company we take on.
Yeah, I feel like the lonely wolves and the spearheads have been done though, right? I think just one other example won't make a difference. So what do you think needs to happen so founders feel safer of going down that path?
I think, as in anything, in any social movement, it always starts with one, and it takes two for one to be the leader and the other the follower, right? And luckily, there have been enough leaders in the industry in the last 30, 40 years who have done it and successfully shown that it works. Ricardo Semler is one of the first that always comes to my mind, simply because he transformed the company in the 80s, and nowadays I would take Haier, the washing machine company from China, I think started in the 90s or 2000s. So there has been companies who've been doing that for decades. There's more and more data points that we can rely on, but more often than not, I encounter founders who have never heard of that. So we do events in our company every few weeks where we invite founders who speak about that topic of self-organizations. And we also invite entrepreneurs. And regularly I have entrepreneurs sitting there who tell me they have heard the word self-organization, but they've never met anybody who's done it. They've never heard of a proof point that it can actually work. And it just feels like a myth to them. And I'm surprised. I mean, I've been living in this bubble for 10 years now. So to me, it's not a myth anymore. But there's still a lot of people, even in my bubble here in Berlin, there's still a lot of entrepreneurs who have never met anybody who's done it successfully. So I do think that it's a train that is slowly starting to move and to collect more people and to slowly open more minds. But we're somehow still early on. So probably not the lonely wolves anymore, but it still feels like we haven't crossed the chasm yet, I would say. Not at all.
Maybe I'm just too impatient.
Probably. And it's good, right? Your impatience is driving us forward also, I think.
Yeah. One topic I would still like to explore is, we talked about what changed for you on a day-to-day basis in terms of working in the company or on the company then. And I would still like to hear, how did it also change how you related to people in the company?
It's a good one. So the interesting thing is, before embarking on that journey, is I had I think, briefly mentioned before, we had tried to take on coaches early on, right, from 2012. And along the path, I had also spoken to founders and coaches who gave me opposite advice. So one of the smart advices I got in 2013 is that as founders, we need our own office. And we need to be able to focus on the important tasks, and we don't need to be meddling with everybody else in the company, right? So at some point, we moved into a previous meeting room, my co-founder and myself, and sometimes we closed the door and we thought, now we're working on the important stuff, right? And people had to knock. And no wonder that obviously it built a massive, it broke down communication by incredible amounts simply because we're not available anymore. So we created this hierarchy, and I realized that I was very far away. And then we had installed those hacks or tried to install tools. Like once a week, I went to lunch with a different employee, thinking that now that every Monday I go for lunch with somebody from the team, I'm super available to them. But oh wonder, because I was not available any other hour of the week, even in that lunch hour, it didn't feel like a natural. And I probably wouldn't say it was on eye level, right? So there was still this hierarchy between them and me. And I think the way we started breaking up hierarchies, or at least changing the flow of power and of hierarchies in the company, created a very different culture of people daring to speak up and actually really show up with all their criticism and with what they were really thinking about the company. So a few years later, after starting to work on myself and my attitude and my belief in management and leadership principles, and then also starting to apply those principles in the company, I think people became much more daring to speak openly, so much more than they ever were before. And it didn't need any system anymore, or an hour or a Q&A session or whatever, but people just became more themselves, and they started to speak up like they would do at home and with their partners and with their friends. So I think what we created over time was a culture where we were actually closer, because there was the gap had somehow disappeared. Probably not entirely, because I was still the founder and CEO to many of them. I don't know. But I do believe we were closer. We were getting closer towards friendships with some people. With some I was obviously closer, and others less so, just as a natural social result. But it definitely felt much more authentic, the connections, than what we had previously. Yeah.
Yes. Can you say a bit more about that? Because you spoke to it and you talked also to how it might have felt to them. But how did it feel for you?
I remember that there were a lot of moments where my co-founder and me had gotten feedback from single individuals who were telling, we never imagined work could be such a great experience, or we never imagined a company would work like this. We never imagined we would have a culture where we trust one another so much, and so on. And when we heard that feedback, that was actually, going back to the extrinsic recognition topic from before, hearing that feedback kind of made us proud of what we had built. And I do think that there were a lot of instances where I was really incredibly happy of how it went and how we had dared to embark on that journey and what we achieved. I definitely was very proud of what we had built. And not so much for the PR bells, because we didn't even do that much. Probably in hindsight, I think for what we had actually built, we could have been much more vocal about it. But it felt great to actually have more vulnerability at work. And not just for me, but really for people being able to cry and to show tears and show all their emotions. At the end of the day, people could be much more, how would I say, much more themselves, with all the fears and negative emotions that are part of our lives, and they didn't have to hide them. I think it's definitely something I am proud of still today, that we managed to build that culture.
Now you took away my last question, what you were most proud of. But that's cool. I'm glad we got there naturally. Is there anything you still want to cover before we wrap this up?
I could speak for hours. There's so many things we could go dive into from left to right. I don't have anything specific coming to my mind. So no, I think not at this point.
Well, then we leave it at this for today. I put a mental pin in the parenting parallels topic, because I think that's a whole other conversation. And I was so tempted to go into it, but I was like, no, not today. Today's for something else. But at some point, I would love to have a conversation about that now that, especially you're also a father and dabble in that area. For me, it has always been like, there's so many similarities here.
Just maybe one thought on that. I actually think it doesn't matter where we start, from what side on, right? But the fact that I started working on the whole topic of leading at work and giving away power obviously made me open to questioning parenting beliefs I had heard from others before, and then reading the kind of books I read. And I recently just read a book from a German author about NVC for kids. Obviously, it's not called NVC for kids, but it's the kind of application of that. It's phenomenal. And I think it doesn't matter where we start. We can start from parenting. We can start from our own relationship. We can start from how we deal with our parents, with really anybody. And then ultimately, because we're just one human and we have one psyche, we will probably end up applying that belief and that attitude to any other area of our life. So to me, it just happened to start with work. It probably doesn't matter where we start, but I think embarking on that and living a much more authentic, much more honest, much more emotional and profound life, I mean, that's the best thing I ever had in my life, right? And that's why I'm so grateful for this crisis I had 15 years ago, because it just allowed me to live such a more fulfilling, so much more joyful and colorful life than I would have lived if I had stick to this whole power, ego, higher, faster, quicker scheme. So yeah, I'm really happy for having had that major fuck up and crisis.
Yeah, that's a great place to wrap this up, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It's really the part that I enjoy, that there's no, I mean, yeah, we prepared some questions, or I prepared some questions, but it's really digging into like, well, where's the edge of what we're just talking about, and where comes the part where we don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Great. Thank you for having me.